Why do mothers breastfeed girls less than boys? Evidence and implications for child health in India. This paper was published in 2011 by Oxford University Press by the researchers Seema Jayachandran and Ileana Kuzymiko. The main focus of this article is the causal chain from desired fertility, in particular son preference, to breastfeeding and eventually to child health and survival. There are lots of references to the research done in a 1997 paper by Narayan Das. Essentially, it has been found that breastfeeding inhibits postnatal fertility, and in developing countries such as India, there is a stop after son or try again for a son fertility strategy. So the authors here attempt to tie these two results together with empirical data and a model for predicting breastfeeding duration. There are four main predictions or hypotheses in this study. According to the slide, number one, duration of breastfeeding increases with birth order. Number two, girls are breastfed less than boys. Number three, children with older brothers are breastfed more. And finally, the gender effect is largest when family reaches its target family size. Here is the data for this research paper. What this shows is the National Family Health Survey in India for 3 cohort years, 1992, 1998, and 2005. Table 1 shows the summary statistics. What it does is it takes this cross-sectional data of ever married women ages 15 to 49 across India. The study calculates birth order and sex from the survey. The sampling restrictions include only relatively recent births, for example, the ones that are contained in the 3 cohort years. The sample excludes mothers who have more than 8 children, multiple births, in other words, twins and triplets, and children who have died. This survey also includes demographic data on contraception, child health, desired fertility, and other standard household characteristics. What's interesting is that the ideal number of children from the survey is not the same as the actual average number of children per family in India. The actual average is more than 4 children per couple. Before I get into the OLS regression method that was used, I want to address a few assumptions of this model. First of all, this model assumes that breastfeeding inhibits fertility. Second, it says that the utility of the mother depends on both the quantity and the sex composition of one's children. In other words, in India, there is a son preference, but conditional on the number of children. And it's said that utility is increasing in the number of sons at a diminishing rate. So in other words, there's a trade-off between the disutility from having another child and positive utility from potentially having another son. So in this method, I've shown you the regression equation. It uses a standard OLS and hazard estimates to estimate breastfeeding as a function of birth order. Age and month fixed effects are added for each of the children in the cohort, in the years of the cohort. Regression estimates observed breastfeeding duration, and it did not observe completed breastfeeding duration, like I said, because some of the recent years of the children in the cohort. The covariates include mother's years of education, age, the child's birth year, and dummy variables for state of residence within India, whether they're urban versus rural, the sex of the child, and the survey wave. Again, the 3 time periods of data. There was no random assignment and no counterfactuals because only observational data was used. It's possible there might be some external validity concerns because of the context of social norms and religious norms in India.
So while this paper does include some more mathematical equations, really the central model is this one, which predicts how long children will be breastfed as a function of their birth order minus the ideal number of children in a family. So we're calling this the delta of ideal, where ideal is the ideal number of children in a family. This is arrived upon through survey results and also for the purpose of this model, the average number of children, which we'll see as 4, is also used in order to help come up with this predicted amount of time breastfeeding. And the intuition is very simple. It's as women approach this ideal number of children, there's less breastfeeding. And then as women reach and pass this ideal number, there's more breastfeeding. And we'll see that, that the results are very much aligned to this predictive model. So we see that the key results are in line with this predictive model, meaning that as women reach the maximum amount of children or ideal amount of children, that the last child will receive a certain amount more breastfeeding than the previous child or sibling. So in a family of 4, which is the average, this comes out to 0.6 months more, whereas with the ideal number of children, which we'll see turns out to be about 2.7, this would be 0.4 months more. And to think of this in a sort of in terms of marginal increases for every 1 unit increase in birth order or number of children, there is on average 0.46 more months of breastfeeding. And then the results also are presented controlling for possible omitted variables such as age, education, state, or residence, sex of child, and whether they live in a rural or urban environment. This average increase reduces to 0.21 more months of breastfeeding. So in real terms, we're talking a little less than a week more of breastfeeding. Or for each 1 unit increase of children, there's a 6% less likelihood of being weaned. So the intuition of this graph is kind of clear to see, even if the details might be a little bit confusing. So basically what we're looking at is the increase in breastfeeding as the birth order increases, and that's clearly the line graph plotted with birth order on the horizontal axis. There's 2 lines here. One is the OLS, so basically the results of the regression. And then the hazard model, I'm not going to go into that. We see the same pattern, so basically it doesn't really need a lot of attention here. And then the birth order coefficients of OLS on the y-axis. But basically what we're seeing is that whether using the variables, the dummy variables, or using birth order itself, we're seeing an increasing trend in breastfeeding and increasing monotonically with increase in birth order, or in other words, with more children. To conclude, the results also indicate that when regressing on sons and daughters as independent variables, we're seeing that sons are breastfed an average of 0.9 months more than daughters. Not entirely surprising, since this paper begins with the premise that there is this preference for sons in India, as well as this phenomenon of trying for a son when having children. We're seeing that this occurs with the ideal family of 2.7. The average family size for the study is 4. But one thing to note, and this reflects back to the previous slide, is that while we see this monotonic increase in breastfeeding, as families grow, clearly families reaching 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 children are going to get some diminished returns, let's say, on their quantity of children that will crowd out any increased return for breastfeeding. So one false conclusion to make here is that having more children is good because they will breastfeed more. And then very significantly, the gender gap in breastfeeding, which is really the central focus of this paper, accounts for roughly 9% of excess female child mortality in ages 1 to 5, and strikingly 15% in ages 1 to 3. and these are referred to as missing children. That is potentially confounded as well with the effect of unclean water in general. So maybe future studies would isolate more this phenomenon of unclean water, which seems to also be a strong cause for infant mortality or young child mortality. So the theme of this entire course has been the gender gap, which we have observed in wages, in education, in labor market participation. And this paper adds to that literature from the point of view of fertility and very specifically breastfeeding. So while it isn't particularly surprising that sons may breastfeed more, or that once families achieve their ideal size and number of sons, that previous siblings to that point would breastfeed less because they're seeking to have more children, and then subsequent children would have the opportunity, let's say, to breastfeed more. What's interesting is really that this can be modeled, and I think that's where this paper really succeeds, is creating a very simple, intuitive model for when breastfeeding occurs or doesn't occur under these circumstances. And this potentially could influence policy decisions to, say, create campaigns that promote the awareness of the correlation between breastfeeding and health, maybe in families that have one or two children, or families that do not have sons. So again, putting this in the context of the course in general, I think what we're seeing here is just another effect that comes from that transition from quantity of children to quality of children that we see with Becker, particularly as economies shift from developing to developed, as countries evolve in that transition. Finally, this paper makes reference to another paper by Das from 1987 that looks at fertility in India, and particularly into the phenomenon of the preference for a son. And while that paper has a variety of results, and some conclusive, some not, that point out that there is this preference, I think it's best summed up with a quote here, that in the absence of a technological fix, fundamental structural and ideological change will be required to reduce the effects of sex preference on fertility. So in other words, part of that shift from quantity to quality will also mean that daughters are considered quality as well. So that the size of family, or the decision to be fertile, is not fueled by this desire to have sons because they will earn more money and participate more in the labor market and ultimately have more opportunity, but rather sons and daughters would have the same amount of opportunity. Therefore, we can just focus on quality attributes that no longer include gender.